All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
The miniseries is a remake of the very popular miniseries originally airing in the 1970s, based off of the New York Times best-selling book Roots, The Saga of an American Family, which was supposedly about the history of the author's family and their involvement in being slaves, but it turned out to be a total fabrication and a hoax, and plagiarized various other novels, now said to be just a novel instead of a hoax. So the History Channel this week is airing a remake of it, and some outlets are pointing out the, quote, problematic history. The New York Post was afraid to call it a hoax. Other outlets will denounce it for the hoax that it is. The Town Hall website, Alex Haley's Roots, the History Channel to remake a lie. There's one problem, the website says. Roots is a fake and Haley is a fraud. And a fraud on multiple levels.
And Alex Haley hadn't wrote none of that. You know, I was out there doing it because I don't care what you think of me. I know he didn't write it. The senior editor of Playboy magazine, Murray Fisher, wrote all of that stuff, okay? And if you punch up on your computer, Harry Hollander, who wrote one of the best books on Africa called The African, a white boy. Kunta Kinte came out of his book word for word. Huh?
Oh, wow.
And if you check out the trial in upstate New York, where a federal judge made the publisher and Alex Haley pay him $650,000 and then chastised, made him apologize to him in the court, and the judge said, I worked a lot of these cases, but I never saw anybody take something word for word like you.
By the Van Sertima, Rutgers University, the author of the book, They Came Before Columbus. Welcome.
Good to be here, Gil.
Now, there's been a lot of discussion lately about Mr. Columbus and what he did and what he did not do. But your research that you've expounded on in previous programs as years gone by, your thesis is older, that our presence in this hemisphere preceded the enslavement period, that there was another period where Africans came. Tell me a little bit more about that and how it pertains to this discussion of Mr. Columbus nowadays.
Well, the first thing that we have to understand is that assume that Columbus was the first to make contact with the Native Americans is something that does not take account of any of the evidence, including the evidence of Columbus himself. Columbus was the first person to suggest there were Africans in America before him. He actually says in the journal of his second voyage that when he was in Haiti, the Native Americans there told him that black-skinned people had come in large boats from the south and southeast trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Columbus actually sent back samples of these gold-tipped metal spears back to Spain. They were assayed, they were inspected by metallurgists in Spain, and the Spanish metallurgists showed that they were identical with spears being forged in African Guinea. Of 32 parts, 18 were of gold, 6 of silver, and 8 of copper, just like the spears in the Caribbean. The words that were used by the people in the Caribbean that Columbus met in Haiti were identical with the words used in Africa all along the Atlantic coast, a range of words used for these spears.
Are there a lot of writings from Mr. Columbus, by Mr. Columbus, that survive? How do you know that he wrote?
Oh, yes. Columbus made up a lot of things, but he wrote quite a lot. I mean, he made up a lot about his background, even his name, etc. But there is no question that he wrote he had at least 4 of his 4 major voyages. He left quite a lot of papers. There's a book published in this country in 1903, 2,114 pages, just on the surviving writings of Columbus, diaries of Columbus, things said about Columbus in connection with these diaries.
Well, before we get into the era that preceded him, let's talk a little bit about Mr. Columbus. Who was he? Was he an Italian? What was his name?
There's a question about Columbus. I have not gone very much into his identity because I know he made up so many things. There's a lot of confusion about that. A book by Frederick Paul, The New Columbus, suggests that he was the bastard son of someone called Colon. His name was Cristobal Colon, and that he took the name Cristoforo Colombo from a dead sailor because he'd been involved in some battle that opposed the Spanish sovereigns, and he needed them at a certain time, and he didn't want them to know about it, so he took on a different identity. There are lots of stories told about
him. So that would suggest he was Spanish? Colon?
Yes. He wasn't Italian, but I don't want to say he was Spanish because I'm making it quite clear there's a lot of confusion about his identity. And I have not been very much involved in that because my great concern has been to show that most people who are opposed to this thesis of an African connection with America are opposed because they assume that Europe was an advance, always an advance of other peoples, and that the reason why Columbus could sail and make contact first was because of the advance in their shipping. What we know now in 12 disciplines, Columbus, by the way, was not the only person to note these blacks. There are at least a dozen Europeans who noted them, in that within the first 50 and 100 years, seeing them in places where they had not been. There's a whole range of them. Peter Martyr, Vasco Nunes de Balbo in 1513, finding blacks among the Native Americans. And he actually asked these people, where did these blacks come from? And they said, we don't know, but they're a large settlement nearby.
Just a bit more about Mr. Columbus, because there's so much discussion. To the best of your knowledge, what was the premise of his voyage? Was it exploration or was it exploitation?
What Columbus hoped to achieve, you see, is that a lot of excitement had developed in Europe about the voyages of Marco Polo, about the riches of India, etc. And to get a route to the rich Indies would be a great achievement. But he assumed that because the world was wrong, and that was not his idea. The Moors had made that quite clear, that the world was wrong, and that if you go far to the west, you end up in the east. He assumed that you could go to the west and end up in India. And he was so convinced of that, that although he landed on the edge, on the little islands on the edge of America, he did not know it was a new continent. He assumed he was off the edge of Asia. Even if he had doubts, he sent his notary, Fernando Pires de Luna, among the ships and made every man sign a document he was off the coast of Asia. And he threatened his men. If they were common sailors and they were to go back home and say that they had not been off Asia, they would be whipped, and they would have their tongues cut out. And if there were officers, they would be fined 500 maravedis. We do not know exactly what 500 maravedis was at that time, but it must have been quite a punishment. So Columbus had to convince the Spanish that he had got to the Indies. And however, something happened which he did not expect. They were discussing a demarcation line with Portugal, because Portugal insisted that they should have a line drawn at the westernmost edge of the Cape Verde Islands, just off Africa, and that 375 leagues should be theirs. And this line, in fact, included Brazil. I have a map of Brazil in 1448. This is more than half a century before Columbus. A map that was drawn on knowledge gained from the Moors. This is known as the Andrea Bianco map. So that, you see, the whole approach was that here we are, this is a great adventure, this is for wealth, etc. To hell with the people. I mean, the people were treated in the most awesome manner. Hands were cut off if they didn't pay the tax. I mean, the most incredible massacres. And Columbus was the first person to actually initiate slavery, because he actually took half a dozen Native Americans with him back to Spain. And people are under the assumption, oh, these natives, they were so stupid they thought the whites were gods. That is not the case. He left a fort in the Caribbean after his first voyage, and every man in that fort was slaughtered when the natives realized that that these people were vulnerable. There are all sorts of things in that situation, but Columbus was absolutely heartless when it came to dealing with the natives. Even when they were kind to him, and he recorded in his diaries how generous these people were, he was so determined, the profit motive was so great, he was so greedy that it didn't really matter. I mean, people became nothing.
To start your day with all the news and information you need to know, start your morning with
Emerge. Subscribe today. Call 1-800-532-5700. That's 1-800-532-5700.
Well, before we go on, what thoughts run through your mind as you see forces being mobilized this year to engage in a massive celebration of this man?
Well, I think that it should be understood that this so-called discovery was a discovery for Europe, and that this led to the ascendancy of Europe. It wasn't purely an accident, because 1492 is a very unusual year. It was not only the year Columbus sailed, it was the very year that the Africans were defeated in Spain. The Moors were defeated in January 1492. The African general Boabdil surrendered in 1492 in Granada, so that the ascendancy of Europe, the 1492 marked the ascendancy of Europe. The tragic thing is that since that time we have assumed, or been made to assume by the histories that have been written, is that people of Native American descent or African descent had inferior civilizations, and that everything European was superior, and that is the reason why Europe gained the ascendancy.
All right. Now let's go back in time to when our ancestors began to reach this hemisphere. Did they engage in hostilities, or were they able to live harmoniously with the indigenous population in this hemisphere?
Well, it depends on the period. In such a short time, I could only touch on the late 14th, 15th century period.
But when did it start?
It started much earlier from different Africans, okay? Because we have evidence in pre-Christian times of Africans entering certain parts of Mexico and South America. We have it from, in terms of various sculptures and in terms of a range of ritual parallels. But in the 14th and 15th century, we move on far more certain ground because the evidence exists in a dozen disciplines. We have writing. They have found one of the African scripts. They have found African boats that could make those crossings. They have found maps indicating a crossing had been made. They have found linguistic connection showing words. They found plants, an American plant in Africa before Columbus, an African plant in America, more than one in fact, African plants in America before Columbus. They found a range of things like this apart from the eyewitness accounts.
Any idea what the motivation might have been for Africans coming to this hemisphere?
In the case of Abubakari II, this we know. The earlier visits, we can only conjecture that there could have been upheavals in the African world, like the Syrians attacking the Egyptians, etc., flights and so forth, trade, etc. But in the case of Abubakari II, we are aware of his motives because it was written down. It doesn't just exist in an oral tradition. It actually exists in Arabic documents like the Al-Kalkashandi and the Masalik al-Absar, that he had expanded as far to the north as the Sahara, as far to the north as the desert, as far to the west as as far to the south, sorry, as the jungle, as far to the east as the Niger, where he was wrestling with other African peoples, the Songhai, and he wanted to cross the ocean because he felt he could expand. Okay.
When he arrived, was his encounter with the indigenous population hostile?
Only in one instance we are aware of hostilities developing, because when strange people enter new territory, the natives might accept them or might not accept them, and hostilities can arise, at least initially. We have cases where where fights actually developed in Panama between black Africans and Native Americans.
What I'm getting at is, was his motive in coming to these shores the same as Mr. Columbus?
No, no, no. You see, in the case of Columbus, Columbus was a man seeking his fortune, who had not made himself. Abubakar II wasn't seeking a fortune, he was already made. He was a great king. He was very rich. He was not seeking the same things as Columbus. He was not driven by the same motives. And we have no evidence of Africans enslaving Native Americans. We have no evidence of them being brought over in situations of captivity. So we have no evidence of that. As I say, hostilities can arise occasionally because of the meeting of two peoples, regardless of race or intention. But we have no evidence that the kind of Columbus enterprise was the same. It was far removed, because the Columbus enterprise, because of the lies of Columbus, it led people coming in millions, a steady, endless stream of Europeans leaving their countries to come in this direction in the hope of finding gold and having people subject to them, etc. This led to a whole different world order.
How does an historian like yourself ascertain that somebody that far back in time was a liar or lied?
Well, because of the conflicting reports, and because of the lot of work has been done recently. One of the works done by Frederick Paul, The New Columbus, where he documents a great deal of things. And I myself, looking over diaries, found inconsistencies, serious inconsistencies, where, for example, Columbus is in Cuba, and the letter arrives from King Ferdinand telling him to come home immediately because someone has appeared at the court, Jaime Ferrer, quarreling about this demarcation line, and which throws a shadow over Columbus. And Columbus pretends that he's too gravely ill to move, would not go back home, and writes in the reply letter that he is certain that Cuba is the continent. Now we know that that is a lie. We know that's dishonesty because I found an earlier letter he wrote 6 months earlier, in which he tells a friend that he's certain Cuba is an island because the natives who lived there for centuries have told him so, and they could circumnavigate it. You find lies also about South America. When he's sent on the third voyage, he's given 6 ships and 3 are sent down to find this landmass that they hear the Portuguese are talking about. Columbus lands on the landmass, does not come off the ship.
Every time we have friends over for a, should we say, little get-together, we reach for the tower. Tower.
And he claims that South America is an island. He claims that Cuba is the continent. Now obviously, and since there are things that indicate that this is not so, I mean, surely he could be wrong about the New World. I mean, he could be wrong about this being India. He could have made a mistake. He could have thought he was off Asia. You could excuse that. But there are certain things you cannot excuse. You see, the man is deliberately involved in deception because he wanted the Portuguese to gain control of that landmass to the south. Because I actually found the letter he wrote one of his sons, Diego Columbus, in which he tells him that Vespucci is about to appear in court, have him do this and do that. The man would do anything for me. In the regular history, it looks like if Vespucci is the rival. He is trying to fill his hand by allowing the Portuguese to enter Brazil and keeping the Spanish out.
Well, why didn't he land on the landmass? Why did he stay on board his ship? Do you know?
We do not know. He claimed he had arthritis. One could accept that if one did not know how mendacious he was, because why wouldn't he claim that for Spain? Why wouldn't he dispute that landmass? But we have evidence that he was getting money from Spain and Portugal, and he was arrested. You see, the Spanish began to realize that Columbus was lying. He and his brother Bartholomew, some people claim that was his uncle, most people think it was his brother, it doesn't matter, but both of them were arrested. On the 4th voyage, the Spanish allowed Bobadilla to arrest Columbus, and he was brought back in disgrace into Spain to be tried for lying to the Spanish about the lands he said he had discovered. And they claimed in court that Columbus was playing games in order to fill his hands, one hand with Portuguese money and one hand with Spanish money.
He was brought back in custody.
Yes.
And he was tried.
He was tried.
Was he convicted?
No. It appears that I wouldn't say he won the case, but because some of the things that he would have got, if it were not for the case, he did lose. He didn't lose all of his fortunes. It was reduced, and he never sailed again. He never sailed again. So he did suffer as a result of the trial, but there were doubts about certain things, and then there were certain people of influence, it seems. Some people have suggested that there was this relationship or a great affection that the Queen had for him, but that is just news of the world stories, so that one does not know what it is that saved him.
What was it that he brought back from the so-called New World on his voyages? You say he made a total of 4 or 6 voyages?
4 voyages.
4 voyages.
On the first trip, one is aware that he brought back the half a dozen Native Americans who were eventually taught to speak Spanish. And of course... As slaves? I wouldn't say they weren't called slaves, but they were brought back against their will. Okay, so I mean, you would call it slaves. I don't know if they were placed in positions
of... Captives, at least.
Yes, captives. Okay, and remember that